Hello everyone. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the fourth semester students of Department of Political Science, Mizoram University. Today I'm going to make a lecture on Michel Foucault, a French philosopher and a historian who became famous for his theory on power-knowledge relationship. Before we looked into his theories and concept, let us first look into his biography. Michel Foucault was born Paul Michel Foucault in Poitiers in France on October 5, 1926. His father was a surgeon who hoped Michel would follow in his footsteps. But unfortunately, Michel was critical of his father's profession, so he was never inclined to follow in the footsteps of his father. Instead, he took to critical studies of various social institutions, which would include medicines, education, psychiatry, and his work on the history of sexuality. And in this regard, he was much influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, Immanuel Kant, and Georges Dumézil. A brief sketch of his education and career would include, first, he enrolled in the École Normale Supérieure, that was in France, a prestigious school in France, in which he took the study of psychology and philosophy. And after his graduation from this Normale Supérieure, he became a member of the French Communist Party from 1950 to 53. But since he was only active or interested in the philosophy of the Marxists, he was never an active participant in the Communist Party. And for a while, he taught philosophy at the University of Lille from 1953 to 54. And from 1954 to 58, he served as a cultural delegate to the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And he also held teaching posts at Warsaw University and the University of Hamburg and the University of Tunis throughout the 1950s and the 60s. And during this time, he earned his doctorate in philosophy. And it was in 1970 that he was elected to the prestigious economic body, which is known as the Collège de France, as a professor of the history of system of thought. So off and on, he went to US, the United States, in 1972, where he gave a lecture on the University of Buffalo and Berkeley. These are some of his education and career that we can highlight. So coming to the concept of power-knowledge relationship, with which he became famous, we can say that Foucault was sometimes considered as a post-structuralist and sometimes as a postmodernist theorist. But we can't say that he was either of the two. So in coming to that, let me highlight his view of power, in which, taking from his own work, it seems to me that power must be understood in the first instance, in which he listed out 4 sentences. 1, the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere. That means for him, power does not reside in one particular solution or in one particular sphere. It is divided, and for him, power seems to emanate everywhere. And another important view of power that he enumerates is that it is a process through which ceaseless struggles and confrontations strengthens or reverses them. That means, in other words, he was of the opinion that this power seems to emanate from everywhere. So, in fact, according to him, power is not a top-down, but rather it is an elevation from below to upwards. So, in fact, power is a process where every individual is involved. So, in other words, the support which these forces relations finds in one another, it's like forming a chain or a system. Therefore, the disjunction and the contradiction which isolate them from one another. So, in other words, he gave a very sophisticated view of power in which there is a relation where power creates knowledge and which knowledge in turn strengthens power. So this is the topic and the concept which we are going to discuss. So in coming to the power-knowledge relationship, Foucault used two methodology. First, which is known as the Archeology of Discourse. This is the first part of his venture into the power-knowledge relationship. Okay, in this, he wrote, "It is these rules of formation which were never formulated in their own rights, but are to be found only in widely differing theories, concepts, and objects of study that I have tried to reveal by oscillating as their specific locus, a level that I have called archaeological." So in other words, when he uses the term archaeology, he doesn't use it in terms as it is traditionally known. For him, the notions of archaeology is to identify the conditions of the possibility of knowledge. That means in a sphere, in an epoch, there are times when there is a possibility of creating knowledge. So therefore, the determining rules of formation of discursive rationality that operates beneath the level of intention or thematic content is what Foucault seems to analyze in his system of archaeology. For his work on archaeology, let us highlight some of the major works which he had wrote. The first one which he wrote in 1961 was known as The Madness and Civilization. Sometimes this book was referred to as the Archaeology of the Silence of the Madman. What does this mean? In this book, Foucault seems to trace the evolution of the mad, how societies, especially in the West, tries to stigmatize and then push them out of the natural inhabitants, or what we call out of the social or society. So in other words, in this archaeology of the silence of the madman, where the mad is regarded as something to be discarded, so the interplay of discourse and institutions in targeting and creating madness as an object of government was what seems to borders Foucault in his pursuit of the archaeology of madness. And the second work that which is a sequence of the Madness and Civilization, was published in 1963, which was titled as The Birth of the Clinic. This is another sequence of the first, a study on the mad, Archaeology of the Medical Gaze. This is an extreme swing toward the structuralism. That means identifying the structures that sustain medical practices and discourse. What does this mean? It means that, for example, it is about the structures in which when a person with knowledge governs a person without the knowledge. For example, here in this book, Birth of the Clinic, he talks about a clinic or a hospitals in which the doctor, who is supposed to have knowledge about the human anatomy and the relationship with his patient, that is the mad. So in other words, the one who wields knowledge seems to have the upper hand in trying to control the actions of the patients, because the wielder of the knowledge is exerting power over the one who is without the knowledge. So in this book or in this research, he identifies the structures that sustain the medical practices and discourse of his time. And the third work that he put forward in his archaeology was The Order of Things, which is an archaeology of human sciences. In this work, he identified 3 epochs or stages of human history, which he termed it as the Renaissance, the Classical period, and the 19th century. So in this, the Renaissance, which is where the power is wielded by the sovereign and the monarch, and the Classical period or the Enlightenment. So in this book, he comes up with the return of language and the birth of man. Because before the Renaissance, everything was about God. Human had no existence. Whatever we think, whatever we do, are supposed to have been what would the extracelestial, the God, would think, would do. So in other words, the God-centered philosophy of the earlier times was discarded, and in this order of things, what we find is the birth of man, in which, due to the process of enlightenment, we see the centeredness of man, in which now the focus of the study was now centered on the significance of man. And in this regard, all social discourses resulted as a result of language. So comes the importance of language. So in this, the order of things, an archaeology of the human sciences, Foucault tries to come up with a differentiation of this development of human sciences into three stages, and in which he talks about the centeredness of man coming into focus. And the last work of the archaeology was the Archeology of Knowledge, which he published in 1969. This is focused on the discourse of a particular period, and we can say this is about a discourse where he talks about the significance of man, taking into account the previous three publications. So, as a result of his archaeology, in which in every discourse, irrespective of the discontinuity between the previous ages, where we can find the truth or the meaning of that discourse, now Foucault comes up to the next methodology, which he called it as the genealogy of discourse. What does this genealogy of discourse entail? According to him, the notions of a genealogy is to analyze the descent of knowledge so that the modes of knowledge are inextricably tied to the eruption of forces, opposition to traditional historical analysis. So what does this mean? See, according to Foucault, there is no meta-narratives or grand narratives. Whatever is happening, it's happening for a purpose, and so he says the aim is to record the singularity of events, to reveal beneath the constructed unity of things not a point of origin, but the dispersion. So in every epoch, in every stages, there is a kind of a truth which is not in connection with the first. So in this genealogy, Foucault does not bother about the origin, but he was focused on the outcome of what can be learned out of that outcome. The disparity and the differences is what matters to Foucault. So, to put it more emphasis is on the material conditions of that discourse defined in terms of the institutions, political event, economic practices, and the processes. So, the term genealogy of discourse would entail the multiplicity of truth or any narratives, and for that, the focus or the emphasis would always be on the material condition of that discourse. What would be the forces or the foundation of what a society enjoys? So that is the process of genealogy so in this regard, we can trace the meaning and the process of genealogy through his major works that he published in 1979. This titled as Discipline and Punish, the Bird of the Prison. This is a very interesting work in which Foucault talks about discipline. So Foucault discusses the period between 1757 and 1830, which focus on the historical formation of the soul, the body, and the subject within various disciplinary matrices of power that operate in the institutions. For example, in this work, there was a very interesting, he called it the panopticon. This is a kind of theory in which he talks about a prison where all the inmates of the prison can be checked and viewed from a particular tower which is in the middle. So the idea is that the inmates, the prisoners, knowing that they are constantly being watched and surveyed, so as a result of that surveillance, there is a kind of discipline in the prisoner, so that until if he do something wrong, he would be seen by the guard at the middle. So as a result of that, there is a kind of a discipline which is emanated in the prisoner. The same process goes in the schools, hospitals and workshops where they are constantly being monitored and surveyed. So surveillance is the key to the creation of these docile bodies, which we call quote unquote. So this resulted in the development and implementation of a new technology which he named it as disciplinary power. The major works after this is the History of Sexuality, which was published in 2 volumes in 1976 and 78. Foucault attempts to write the history of the polymorphous technique of power that since the end of the 16th century, it had vigorously inscribed the body within the discourse of sexuality governed by a scientific will to knowledge. Instead of conceiving of modernity as involving the prohibition of sex, Foucault conceived of modernity as involving its deployment into different discourse. So he introduced the concept of the power. So what does this mean, this history of sexuality? It's another concept in which we shall discuss further, but before we come to that, let us look at the operations of power, knowledge in the concept of Foucault. Having talked about the methodology, which can be divided into 2 phases, the first phase, which we had mentioned it as the archaeological phase, was seen in terms of the accumulation of knowledge with regard to the hospital and psychiatry. And the next is the methodology of genealogy, in which Foucault tries to defragment the various discourses and coming out with as a result of the analysis of the material forces, the institutions and so on and so forth. So as a result of these 2 methodologies, Foucault conceived of 3 powers, a form of power. The first form of power that he sees or conceived is titled as the sovereign power. What does this mean? Under the feudal and monarchical system, power is embodied in the person of the sovereign, who has an unlimited power over his subject. So generally the feudal monarch or the lord exercised power intermittently in the specific episodes to ensure the periodical transfer of the product of labor from the laborer themselves. So, in other words, we can say the monarch presented itself as a kind of a referee, a power capable of putting an end to war, violence, and a pillage and saying no to the struggles and private feuds. So, in other words, the power is embodied in the person of the monarch, and this is what represents or which is known as the politico-juridical functions of the monarch. So, in other words, the power emanates from the top to the bottom. But however, according to Foucault, there is another kind of power which we had already mentioned very vaguely, that is the disciplinary power. From his study of the genealogical books that we had already mentioned, so in that, Foucault demonstrates that in the 17th and the 18th century, there emerges a new, a more efficient and a profitable form of power. This disciplinary form attempted to put in place people under continuous surveillance rather than to subject them to a specific physical punishment, as it was earlier done in the archaeological studies. So in this regard, disciplinary power can be again highlighted into 3 types. The first, which he called, is the hierarchical observation. This ability of those in charge to observe their entire range of surveillance in a single gaze. I had talked about the concept of the panopticon, in which the authority can observe the behavior and thereby gain the discipline of those that are looked or surveyed. That's the hierarchical observation. Then comes the judgment of the normality. This is the ability to determine who is normal and who is not, and to punish those who violate the norms. So in other words, in a disciplinary power, the first is where we find the hierarchical observation in which you are given the ethical notions of what to do and what not to do. So in other words, in the judgment of normality, the idea is that who is normal and who is not. So a person who is normal, for example, in time, for example, you were supposed to come to the class at 10 o'clock, but if you're late for that, then you are not normal. Activity in the class, if you are not attentive to what the teacher is teaching, then you are not active and attentive, then you are not normal. So in other words, the judgment of normality is what constitutes a student to behave in a docile manner. So in other words, we can say that's the concept of disciplinary power that has been given in the society. And the third is the examination. The examination, observation of people and the judgment of them according to the norms. For example, a student at the end of the semester would have to sit for their exam. And in the exam paper is where the teacher evaluates the students, whether he is normal or not normal, according to his response to the questions that the teachers gave. So in other words, it makes use of the hierarchical observation and uses science to determine the standards of normality in all spheres of life. So in other words, disciplinary power and normality or norms and normalization goes hand in hand together. Until and unless you are normal, you are considered as abnormal, and hence you are subjected to punishment. So in other words, disciplinary power is very important, and this constitutes the crux of the society in the modern age. Then comes the concept of biopower. Biopower focuses on the body and the target's whole population instead of a particular individuals or collections of individuals. So in other words, what does this entail? For example, biopower, according to Foucault, took on two forms, which he called it as the anatomopolitics. And this is especially aimed to discipline the human body. And secondly, he talks about biopolitics, and this is what concerns us as students of political science, which aims at controlling and regulating the population growth, health, life expectancy, and so on and so forth. See, Foucault argues that government perceived that they were dealing with the problems of controlling the whole populations in terms of such variables like birth and death rates, life expectancy, fertility, state of health, frequency of illness, and so on and so forth. See, and as a result of this biopolitics, we see the governmentality putting their power over the populations in terms of such variables like looking into the birth and death rates of the certain sections of the population, the life expectancy of sections of the populations, their fertility, their state of health. So accordingly, policies would be made in which it would deal with such variables in the society, and as a result of which the populations has to endure the policies of the government. So as a result of this, Foucault talks about the biopower, in which this power seems to emanate from the control of the body, the sexuality in his own quote-unquote words, in which he talks about the power that emanates as a result of this conception. So, taking into account the three forms of power, let us look into the nature of the modern forms of power and knowledge relationship, which Foucault culminates as a result of his study on the power. So, he says Foucault views the modern society as highly differentiated and fragmented. So, within this society, power itself is variegated, draws upon many different sources, and can be found in a diversity of science and social relations. So this is the crux of Foucault's concept of power, in which, as a result of his study on the types or forms of power, as a result of the genealogical processes, he says, in a modern society, the power seems to emanate from everywhere, and hence modern society is highly differentiated and fragmented. Because within that society, power itself is variegated. It draws upon many different sources. It can come from anywhere. So it can be found in a diversity of sites and social relations. So we shall admit, according to his own word, we shall admit rather that power produces knowledge, and not simply by encouraging it because it serves power or by applying it because it is useful, that power and knowledge directly imply one another. That there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge. So in Foucault realized that power and knowledge directly imply one another. That means, in other words, through knowledge, one gains power, and when one is in power, it tries to develop more knowledge so as to sustain that power. So there is no power relations without the correlative institutions of a field of knowledge. That is what human relationship entails, because power seems to emanate from everywhere. So knowledge that does not presupposes and constitute at the same time power knowledge is not knowledge, according to Foucault. See, so coming towards the end of my lecture, the nature of the modern forms of power, which Foucault had written, is that in his study of the various forms of power, he realized now that power is exercised and it is not produced or possessed. What does it mean? Because by this statement, he means that all individual exercises and are subjected to power through a net-like organization. So as an individual, my relationship with my class or my friend, we all exercise one form of power or the another. And in other words, on the other side, we are all subjected to power, and hence this social net-like organization, because power seems to emanates. So, and another point that he come up with is that power is not always exercised as a repressive force against those who we could normally think lack power. Actually, it is reinforced, strengthened by and involved those who struggled against it. What does this entail? The forms of dominations are built into the very understanding of the common activity. For example, in a democratic setup of modern society, how does those who are in power come into power? Through the consent of the people who elects them. So in other words, the power of those who are in the government are reinforced by the people themselves. So the forms of dominations are built into that very system. So that became the crux or the substance of that relationship. And according to Foucault, these power relations are not universal in nature. The idea is that they define innumerable points of confrontation. They focus on the instability of which has its own risk of conflict, of struggle. So, in other words, for example, this is where Foucault asserted that there is no absolute truth. What is truth in one society may not be the same truth in another society. What does Foucault mean by this is that here in Foucault we find the incredulity towards the meta-narratives, in which he says that there can be no absolute truth because it depends on the context in which we try to express the truth. What is the truth in one society may not be the same. For example, what I used to teach in the class is that in a certain society, for example, teaching or stealing may be considered as an ultimate sin, which would necessitate a punishment. But however, if we looked into the context of how a person steals, for example, he could not get any employment, even though he looks for an employment. No one is giving him any employment. But as a human being who enjoys the right to life, he needs to feed his own stomach to live. So, having no alternatives, he steals his neighbor's food. So, in that context, the truth says that stealing should be punished because it is a sin, a crime. But however, if we look into the context of that individual who steals, he has no alternatives. So what should be the idea of the truth in that situation? So that is where Foucault looks into by saying that power relations are not universal in its nature. The last point that I would like to make with regard to his conception of the relations to power knowledge is that the operation of power cannot be separated from the treatment of knowledge and discourse, because the knowledge and the discourse of the specific time and the society needs to be taken into account. So without the knowledge of the discourse, there can be no power, and vice versa. So coming to my last slides, the power-knowledge relationship also entails the resistance to power. Because whenever there is an exercise of power, there would also always entail a resistance to that power. Resistance is in fact a fundamental structure, a structural features of power. Where there is power, there is a resistance. And yet, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relations to that power. It would always be embedded with the relations between power and knowledge. So in the relations of power, there is necessarily the possibility of resistance for it. So in the next class, hopefully we can talk about the technology of the self, where Foucault continues with his discussion on the resistance of power. But for today, I would like to end my lectures. Have a good day.